After conducting some research, we found that the area is struggling with a bacteria known as Cyanobacteria, otherwise commonly known as blue-green algae. So what is this, and who and what is it affecting? Here's a couple of images sent in by some concerned citizens with this green mucky substance, usually showing up in streaky patterns. And lately we've been finding these dead organisms showing up in the waters as well, the same waters that are being affected by this green mucky substance. Most commonly, though, we're finding fish. So it is a cause for concern for ourselves as well as the mammals and aquatic organisms present in these bodies of water. So again, this is a bacteria. It's not an algae. Again, although it's most commonly known as blue-green algae, it tends to mimic the look of green algae. It actually plays a very large role in sustaining the biosphere homeostasis by taking atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into an organic matter that a lot of organisms can use for survival. There are over 6,000 species of this bacteria, and some of these are toxic. Microcystins is usually the most common toxin that we come across. It's a unicellular organism, so incredibly tiny, and if you find it in large amounts, it's generally due to these harmful algal blooms. So these toxins that are released that cause these blooms are intracellular, meaning they're inside of the cell. So once algal blooms are created and the growth is uncontrollable, the blooms begin to die off due to lack of nutrients, and that's when those cells burst and these toxins are released, causing these harmful algal blooms. So why are they here? Well, they thrive on nitrogen and phosphorus. Too much of these nutrients and the ecosystem can't handle the growth and it becomes uncontrollable. So then these bacteria start dying off from, again, lack of nutrients, and that causes more toxins to be released. So where does this excess nitrogen and phosphorus come from? Well, these can come from pesticides and fertilizers, septic systems, agricultural runoff from crops, landfills, water treatment plants, etc. And this is a great visual of really how that happens. You have all of this runoff from all of these different areas that eventually lead to, again, buildup of nitrogen and phosphorus, and that can lead to smaller bodies to larger bodies of water gaining this uncontrolled growth of blooms. Another contributing factor is climate change. So an example would be if you had a large amount of rain for a few days, followed by a large amount of sunshine, intense sunlight, and heat for a period of time as well. That is perfect climate activity for biological activity for growth of blooms. Bodies of water that can be affected are those warm, slow-moving, or standing waters where there's just lack of aeration and so lack of oxygen. What do they do for and to the ecosystem? So directly, the negative impacts of these toxins is when these cells burst and their internal contents are released. So once these plethora of blooms begin to die off, their cells burst and those inner toxins are released. So those can start to affect the internal functions of aquatic organisms within the water. Indirectly, oxygen depletion is usually the most common cause of death between organisms and cyanobacteria. So the buildup of the blooms on top of the water can prevent sunlight from reaching organisms submerged underneath that require it for photosynthesis. And that eventually begins to just start killing off all the various species in the water. Another contributor to oxygen depletion is when the blooms grow during the daytime, they die off at night, and that just eventually starts taking away more and more oxygen. And this is a great visual of just that toxic algal cycle and how harmful it is to the ecosystem. You've got that murky water on top. It just starts to slowly decrease the oxygen levels, and then fish, algae, and plants begin to die, and then phosphorus and nitrogen are released from the muck, and then that kind of moves upward, and that just starts the cycle over again. So how are they harmful to humans? Well, in these toxins, you have hepatotoxins, which are liver toxins. You have neurotoxins that are toxins that affect the central nervous system. You also have toxic alkaloids that can affect the renal and digestive systems. So, in symptoms, mild can be irritations of the eyes, the skin, the nose, and then on the severe side, you have diarrhea, vomiting, cramps, fever, sore throat, joint and muscle pain. Long-term exposure is still being studied, but it's potentially shown to cause cancer, which is really a cause for concern. So, microcystins being the most common algal bloom, I wanted to kind of take a closer look at what that does on a cellular level to humans and fish alike. So, they are hepatotoxins, they affect the liver, and what they really do is prevent protein phosphatase from happening. So protein phosphatase is when these enzymes remove phosphate from proteins. And the prevention of this process is what eventually ends up destroying the liver and the structure of the liver. So protein phosphatase in fish is incredibly important during the embryonic development. It regulates the certain critical development processes, and in most aspects of cell life across the board are regulated by protein phosphorylation and dephosphorylation. Those are incredibly important critical processes in cellular life and signaling. So inhibition of this process eventually results in widespread cellular death and loss of liver structure. Here's a good visual of all the various toxins that can affect the human body. As you can see, microcystins can affect the liver, the lungs, the immune system, the stomach, the small intestines, and the colon. In fish, again, they're harmful due to directly the release of toxins, indirectly it's oxygen depletion, but on a more specific level, it really depends on the species of fish, the species of organism, as well as the type of toxin that's released. But indirectly through oxygen depletion, that can happen from when these organisms die off. Microbial organisms in the water will start to feed on these decaying fish and organisms, which further contributes oxygen depletion. Again, the death of blooms, and then this can all make it really difficult for organisms with gills to be able to breathe. So eventually fish either leave the area or die. This is a good visual pre-bloom. You've got the excess of nitrogen and phosphorus, which is just right for algal growth. When in bloom, there's an overabundance of chlorophyll A, and that makes the water murky, and it kind of prevents photosynthesis from happening. And then when these blooms die off, it's just a complete waste of water. There's no oxygen, and so there's no living organisms. So how can we identify these bacteria, and how can we better learn the difference and prevent these tragic instances of human contact and sickness happening? So there are some similar plants. You've got this green algae that's the most commonly mistaken for blue-green algae. The best way to determine is if you had a pitchfork and you went out and dug up green algae, that's going to be stringy and it's going to hang on to that pitchfork. But if you go out with a pitchfork and try and scoop up blue and green algae, you're not going to get anything, because again, those are unicellular organisms, and so it's just going to fall apart. They're not going to stick together like green algae would. Duckweed is the most commonly mistaken as well, but really you can tell these are duckweed by their little itty-bitty leaves. And then another mistaken identity for blue-green algae is pollen. But pollen really presents itself more as a yellow substance on the water and doesn't tend to kind of consume the body of water itself. So blue-green algae in particular is going to have a pea soup consistency. It's going to have an oily sheen look to it. The surface is going to look scummy and foamy. And there's going to be a lot of discolored streaks in the water, like what we've shown in the beginning. And right here, you've got these kind of green or blue discolored streaks, as well as floating clumps or globs. So what can we do to kind of prevent this from happening and do our best to save these species being affected, as well as protect ourselves? So we can find ways to prevent and minimize chemical runoff that prevent nitrogen and phosphorus runoff. We can slowly start to remove these harmful algal blooms, because if we were to do that all at once, again, that would just kind of further the oxygen depletion of the water. Keeping up with regular water quality testing to, again, measure those levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and stay ahead of those algal blooms. We can contribute aeration systems and ponds, lakes, and other small bodies of water that are applicable. We can be more responsible in disposing of our organic material so that we're not further building up the contribution to decaying matter in water. And then lastly, we can work on biological augmentation, which is the process of introducing certain bacteria and proteins into the water to further the stopping and the preventing of those blooms from forming.